Okay, let's do a quick review. We have Ned Boone, who got decapitated. We got the son of Daniel Boone, James, who was murdered by the Shawnee and Cherokee when they first went into Kentucky by Big Jim, supposedly. Thomas and Israel Boone died at the Battle of Blue Licks, last battle of the Revolutionary War. Daniel Boone watched and observed all these. All these were his family. Israel and James Boone were his sons. Thomas was his nephew. Ned was his brother. They beheaded Ned. They beheaded him. And I still didn't figure out if Mary Draper Ingalls or if Jenny Wiley was the first white female in Kentucky. So you'll need to figure that out for yourself. But I'm just planting the seed so that way you'll always be wondering it. I'll be wondering it. Maybe one day one of us will actually figure it out and tell the other person. Thomas Ross is the first postmaster who got massacred in Kentucky. He's the first postmaster in Danville, Kentucky. That's where the first post office was established. Killed in 1793 in Laurel County, southeast Kentucky. John Stewart was found in a hollow tree in 1774, 5 years after December 22nd, a few days before Christmas, 1769. Supposedly been killed with Daniel Boone. And then later on, they found his bones in a tree. But he had married one of the Boone's daughters, I think Daniel Boone's daughter. So how clever, right? To go snipe hunting and then to wipe him out. Martin and Ruddle Station burned down to the ground June 22nd, 1780. Let's just actually knock some of this stuff out. Okay, so Daniel Boone. In 1768, an English explorer named John Finley passed through the Yadkin Valley and visited Daniel Boone, with he had served in the French and Indian War. Finley told, so Daniel Boone fought for the English, right, just like George Washington. So he was a British man for the longest time. He even get court-martialed in Kentucky for being a Brit. Finley told Boone of the natural splendor of Kentucky's bluegrass region, which he had visited as a merchant before the French and Indian War. So John Finley is the one who is credited with getting Daniel Boone's attention turned on to Kentucky. So that's John Finley is also the person who was living in a Skippakittakee in 1774, the last white man in a Skippakit, the last Shawnee village in Kentucky was called a Skippakittakee, and John Finley was the last white man to see it. Supposedly he was a trader. He was I thought he was with the French, but I guess he was like an English trader, or not a traitor. Could have been a trader, but he traded things. And so there was a town, a big mecca in the middle of Kentucky where lots of Shawnee, Cherokee, lots of people, French, were trading with each other. John Finley had been there for a few years, and then some sort of argument, he leaves. But he shows Daniel Boone a Skippakittakee. He comes back and he shows the exact spot. Here it is, but this time it's 10 years, 20 years later, and it's gone. So, did John Finley actually have something to do with it? Was he with the English when they burned it all down? Did they save this spot for the English eventually? Yeah, so, that's under the Long Hunter. It's the Wikipedia. And John Finley's an Irishman. Okay, so it is seen from this that Kentucky was first explored in the middle of the 18th century by one who, in all probability, was an Irishman. Of the incidents in his long journey, there appears to be no record. We're only told that he had the hardihood to undertake a task from which all but the bravest shrunk, that he went far away into the wilderness, hitherto untrodden by a white man, that he set an example for the others who followed the same route several years after the journey. Must have occupied many weeks, but no details seem to be obtainable from any of his historical works that we've examined of the arrival of the pioneer and his companions at the Kentucky River of their return to Virginia. We do know that they were the first white men to penetrate a hitherto unknown countries beyond the remotest frontiers of American civilization. So some Irish nationalization, or nationalism. He's born in 1722, John Finley, sometimes spelled John Findley, F-I-N-D-L-E-Y, with the D, sometimes without it. Born in Northern Ireland, John Finley immigrated with his family to Pennsylvania where in his early 20s. Oh, okay, he immigrated to America in his early... So he was an Irishman, John Finley was. 1744, he's granted a license to trade with the Indians in the Upper Ohio River. 1744 he got a license. So he was there till 1752, 54. So he was there for about 8 years. And he's trading on the Upper Ohio River. In the following years, he ranged throughout present-day eastern Kentucky and southern Ohio. So he went up and down, right, for 10 years or so. He was there as Skippakittiki. In 1752, John Finley was taken captive by Shawnee Indians near the falls of the Ohio. He was taken to the Indian villages in the Kentucky lowlands, where he was one of the first non-Indians to see the fertile foresting prairies that later became known as the bluegrass country of Kentucky. Although he was at first unsure of where he was in relation to the settled regions to the east, Finley soon learned from other itinerant traders that the region was readily accessible from western North Carolina and what is now eastern Tennessee by way of the Cumberland Gap. Within a short time, the Shawnee released Finley, and he made his way back to the settlements on the Pennsylvania frontier. So he's a Pennsylvania one. The Pennsylvania frontiers people were worse than the Virginians. Although there was a growing demand for new lands to settle, his reports of the bluegrass country were not followed up due to the outbreak of the French and Indian War in 1754. In that conflict, John Finley befriended frontiers Daniel Boone. John Finley served as a wagon driver in the General Edward Braddock's unsuccessful 1755 campaign against Fort Duquesne near present-day Pittsburgh. In that campaign, John Finley befriended frontiersman Daniel Boone. So this is the French and Indian War, and so he was with the British for about 10 years in Kentucky, you know, exploring, trading with things. He had a license, and he was in the Skippakittiki. Supposedly he was kidnapped by the Shawnee, but I heard that he was there on his own accord and he was trading with them, and then eventually he gets attacked by Philip Phillips, a Frenchman, Philip Phillips, and then some Christian Ottawas, like some northern Native Americans. After the wars ended in 1763, Finley became a peddler of wares to frontier housewives. Okay, so then he's just a peddler of wares, right? Hey, buy this spoon, buy this thing, buy this thing. So he's a crook, he's a criminal who knows what to believe with anything he says. He's like Jim Bowie. While wintering with Boone in 1768-69, Finley related accounts of the possible route. So then they go check it out, right? Daniel Boone. The men worked in pairs, Squire with Neely, Boone with Stuart. Yeah, this is actually all, this doesn't even have anything to do with John Finley. He was just another person who gets tore up and ripped to shreds and dies, you know, alone in a hole, killed by Indians. This is a Daniel Boone. It seems like everything Daniel Boone touches, he just kills everything. He just spreads his disease everywhere. When the Boones moved from Pennsylvania to the Yadkin River area in North Carolina, Daniel Boone struck up a friendship with John Stewart, a skilled outdoorsman. And Daniel Boone and John Stewart started to explore the wilderness around 1865. John Stewart married Daniel Boone's little sister, Hannah. So what's going to happen to John Stewart? The same thing that happened with John Finley and Ned Boone and Israel and Thomas, James. So around 1865, Stuart married Boone's little sister Hannah. The hunting trip that began in May 1769 lasted for a year. Boone and Stuart went off by themselves and twice was captured by Indians. All this was taking place in what was now southeast Kentucky. They escaped in January 1770, finally rejoined the rest of the party, including Boone's brother Squire, who had set out from the Yadkin River area to search for Daniel. Daniel, Squire, and Stuart decided to stay in Kentucky and explore some more, and the rest returned to North Carolina. When Daniel and Squire Boone returned to the Yadkin region 6 months later, and they reported that Stuart had gone off to hunt and never returned, he was presumed dead. About 5 years later, while leading a group of settlers into Kentucky, Daniel Boone, by chance, happened upon a hollow tree which contained none other than the body of John Stewart, which is random. He reported this to his sister Hannah Boone Stewart, and she was finally able to get on with her life. What happened to Your friend John Stewart, didn't you? And your friend John, what John? I don't know. Oh my God, here's a tree. Very convenient. Very convenient. Hamilton marries Richard Pennington. They remained in the general area of the Yadkin River. So if Stuart had survived that hunting trip in 1769, Jackson County would probably have never seen a Pennington. I've always looked with suspicion on the circumstances of John Stewart's death. Isn't it interesting how Daniel Boone accidentally stumbled across the hollow tree while leading the settlers several years later? Kentucky was too big and too untamed in 1775 for this to be a coincidence. How did John Stewart really die? He's insinuating Daniel Boone had something to do with it, didn't he? Here's what they talk about John Finley. Boone and Stuart, finding their station camp abandoned, headed south, meeting up with Finley and the camp keepers on the Rock Castle River. Boone and Stuart were pleased to find the party had been joined by Squire Boone and another hunter, Alexander Neely, who had come out from North Carolina with new supplies, traps, and ammunition. Despite the Shawnees warning about the stinging of the wasp and the yellow jackets, the two, Boone, Stuart, and Neely, went northward to continue their hunting. The gamekeepers went back to North Carolina and never came back to Indian country. Finley went back to Pennsylvania, resumed trading, was robbed again by Indians, went west again in 1772, and disappeared without a trace. So John Finley, the guy who was in a Skippy, the last man who had actually seen it, supposedly got kidnapped by one of these reports by this Shawnee. Right, so wouldn't you want to enact revenge, show no mercy to these people that kidnapped you, that kidnapped all these other people? He's part of the English. 1754 is when the French and Indian War began. 1754 is when the town of the Skippy ends. It's convenient. The years are too close to each other. Had been the British. The British burned it down and came back, picked it up later. Daniel Boone could have just been working for the crown the whole time. So that's what happened to John Finley. He went back to Pennsylvania, resumed trading, was robbed again by the Indians. Went west again, 1772, and disappeared without a trace. So robbed, resumed trading, went west, disappeared. The men worked in pairs, Squire with Neely, Boone with Stuart, and sometimes were away from the base camp for several days. One of these trips in the late winter of 1770. I heard December 22nd, 1769. Daniel Boone and Stuart divided on either side of Kentucky River to check their trap lines. Daniel Boone returned to their temporary camp that evening, but John Stewart failed to appear. So again, on the trips, late winter, 70 is what they said, 1770. Boone and John Stewart divided on either side of the Kentucky River to check their trap lines. Boone returned to their temporary camp that evening, but Stuart failed to appear. A heavy rain had swollen the river, so Daniel Boone assumed that his brother-in-law was merely having difficulty crossing. After several days, the river fell, but John Stewart did not show up. Fearing the worst, Daniel Boone crossed. He found the remains of a fire and John Stewart's initials carved on the back of a tree, but no traces of the man himself. So this is according to Daniel Boone, right? So he crosses the river. Why they got traps on both sides of the river? He found the remains of a fire and Stewart's initials carved on the back of a tree. So he saw a fire had been started, and Stuart had been there for at least a day, but couldn't find the actual man himself. It was not until 1770. Remember, this is married to Daniel Boone's sister, Hannah. So was there bad blood between these two men? It was not until 1775, during the expedition to cut the Wilderness Road, that one of Boone's men found a skeleton and powder horn with John Stewart's initials wedged into the hollow of a sycamore tree. So they found another tree with his initials on it. Oh, powder horn. Okay. But they found a skeleton and a powder horn with Stewart's initials wedged into the hollow of a sycamore tree. So possibly John Stewart lit this fire, was on the other side, and then got killed by the Native Americans. And then they shoved his body into the hollow of a sycamore tree. He could have been killed by anybody. It could have been killed by Daniel Boone himself. It could have been killed by anybody and just shoved into the tree himself. They said they found a skeleton. So that doesn't say where the bullet hole was or what kind of, was there a point, an arrowhead nearby? Was the skull collapsed? The powder horn with his initials right next to it, kind of indicates it was him. but not necessarily who did it. But it says here that he was badly shaken by the disappearance, so I'm sure if they allege it, then it's true. So it's John Stewart, and we'll find out the Jenny Wiley thing.